When viewers tuned in to Daystar, they expected faith, hope, and family. Not a scandal that would rock the Christian world. But now, shocking revelations are surfacing about Joni Lamb, missing millions, and secrets buried deep inside the network. What really happened behind the cameras? Who knew the truth? And how did everything built in God's name start to crumble from within? The answers will leave you stunned. It started quietly. No cameras, no crowd, just 3 people sitting in a small boardroom at Daystar. The air felt still, polite even, until Jonathan Lamb asked one question that would change everything. He looked at his mother and said, "Mom, did you really use $100,000 of Daystar money for your honeymoon?" The words hung in the air like a weight. Joni didn't answer right away. She looked calm, maybe a little cold, the way someone does when they're caught off guard but trying not to show it. Next to her sat Tom Calendarer, her close friend and trusted board member. He shifted in his chair and gave a short laugh, the kind that tries to smooth things over. "We'll just gift it to her," he said casually, as if it were nothing. But to Jonathan, it wasn't nothing. He'd grown up watching his parents build Daystar from scratch, a ministry that had become a symbol of faith for millions. People had given their last dollars believing it was for God's work. They donated out of love, out of hope. And now, sitting in that room, it hit him that the money was being treated like a personal wallet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone, but something shifted inside him. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have. This wasn't about a single trip or a single check. It was about what that decision meant. It meant that no one was watching, no one was questioning, and maybe no one even cared. That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the meeting in his head. Tom's words, his mother's quiet reaction, the casual way $100,000 of donor money was brushed aside. He prayed, he wrestled, he asked himself if he was overreacting. But deep down, he knew he wasn't. It wasn't about family loyalty or protecting an image. It was about doing what was right. So, he decided to speak. Not to shame his mother, not to destroy the ministry, but because someone had to tell the truth. That single question, simple, honest, and brave, became the spark that exposed everything hiding behind Daystar's polished image. When Jonathan first asked about the money, he thought maybe it was just a mistake, an oversight, something that could be fixed. But as he started to dig deeper, what he found wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was a system. A hidden structure built over years, designed to look holy on the outside while keeping everything inside untouchable. Daystar had always presented itself as a beacon of faith, a global Christian network spreading hope, worship, and the gospel to millions. On the surface, it looked perfect. Polished broadcasts, powerful sermons, heartfelt prayer lines. But behind the bright lights and smiling faces, there was something else. The deeper Jonathan looked, the more he realized that Daystar didn't operate like a normal ministry. It didn't have open records, financial reports, or outside audits like most nonprofits did. In fact, it didn't have to. That's when Jonathan learned the truth that changed how he saw everything. Daystar wasn't registered as a nonprofit media company. It was legally listed as a church. That one word changed everything. Because as a church, Daystar didn't have to file annual tax reports. It didn't have to show where the money went, how much came in, or how much went out. No one outside a tiny circle had access to the numbers. And inside that circle were only 3 people: Joni Lamb, her son Jonathan, and her close friend and board member, Tom Calendarer. 3 people overseeing a multi-million-dollar operation that collected donations from around the world. There was no large board of directors, no independent accountants, no financial watchdogs. Decisions were made privately, usually by Joni herself, and the rest just went along with it. At first, Jonathan didn't think much about the structure. After all, his parents had always been trusted leaders. They had preached about integrity, about living transparently before God and people. But now, after that meeting, those words started to feel hollow. He began to wonder how many times similar decisions had been made behind closed doors. Money moved, gifts given, trips funded, all without the people's knowledge. He looked back at how Daystar operated. Donors called every day giving what they could. Some sent in small checks with handwritten notes. "This is all I have, but I hope it helps." Elderly widows, single mothers, young families, They all believed their money was helping spread the gospel. They trusted Joni and the ministry completely, but in reality, no one outside that inner circle could see what their money actually did. The power structure was airtight. Everything funneled through Joni. She approved spending. She signed the checks. She made the final calls. On camera, she was warm, gentle, and spiritual. Off camera, she was the CEO of an empire, one with no oversight. If she wanted to label something a ministry expense, she could. If she wanted to call a personal luxury a gift, no one could stop her. There were no rules in place to challenge her authority. Jonathan started noticing patterns: lavish studio upgrades, expensive productions, private flights, designer wardrobes. None of it was illegal on paper, but morally, it started to feel wrong, especially when people donating were scraping by just to give. It wasn't about greed, he realized. It was about a system that made greed possible. Daystar's church status wasn't a loophole by accident. It was intentional. It allowed Joni to run a global network with near total privacy. The IRS didn't ask questions, and the law didn't require answers. While other charities had to file public forms each year, showing every dollar spent, Daystar didn't. It was protected under the same rules as small local churches, the ones that passed a plate on Sundays, not multi-million-dollar media empires broadcasting worldwide. Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time he looked at the glowing screens, the carefully written fundraising messages, the emotional appeals for donations, he felt a pang in his chest. People were giving in good faith, believing their gifts were going toward missions, outreach, and ministry work. But how much of it really was? No one outside that small room could ever know. He began to see how the structure itself had been built to hide things, not just the honeymoon money, but everything. The more secretive the setup, the easier it became to blur the lines between ministry and personal life, between what belonged to God and what belonged to Joni, between faith and business. For years, no one had questioned it because everything looked blessed. The shows were successful. Donations poured in. The Lamb family seemed untouchable. To viewers, Joni was a trusted spiritual leader. To those inside, she was the boss. And you didn't question the boss. That's what made the $100,000 so significant. It wasn't just the amount. It was the proof that the system worked exactly as it was designed to, quietly, privately, without accountability. One decision made behind closed doors, using money that didn't belong to them, and no one outside the room would ever have known. Jonathan realized that the problem wasn't just one person's actions. It was the entire foundation. The very way Daystar was built allowed this kind of thing to happen. And for the first time, he couldn't look at it as a ministry anymore. It was an empire, one that preached about light but operated in the shadows. As the truth started to surface, Jonathan understood that speaking up wouldn't just expose a single incident. It would expose the system itself, the structure that let millions flow without oversight, that let power go unchecked, that let one family decide what God's money really meant. And once he saw it for what it was, there was no unseeing it. At first, it was just a rumor, a whisper that floated through quiet conversations and private messages, something about Joni Lamb, something about money. Nobody wanted to believe it. After all, Joni wasn't just another TV host. She was a spiritual figure to millions. People had watched her pray with guests, comfort strangers, and speak words that felt inspired. But whispers have a way of spreading, and soon, what started as a private question turned into a storm that Daystar could no longer hide from. It began when pieces of Jonathan's story leaked, not from anger or revenge, but from someone who couldn't stay silent anymore. A trusted source repeated what had been said in that boardroom, that Joni had used $100,000 of ministry money to pay for her honeymoon with Doug Weiss, and that it had been quietly labeled as a gift. Once that detail reached the outside world, everything changed. Within days, blogs and Christian forums were buzzing. Could this really be true? Did Joni misuse donor funds? Is this the beginning of the end for Daystar? The conversations grew, and soon, even people who had never questioned the ministry before were starting to wonder. Social media lit up with questions that no one at Daystar was answering. The silence was deafening. At first, Daystar's team tried to ignore it. No statements, no posts, nothing. They acted like it wasn't happening, but silence only made things worse. When people feel betrayed, they don't stop asking. They get louder. Supporters who had given for years began sharing their stories online. "I sent my last $50 because I believed in Joni's message," one woman wrote. "Now I feel like a fool." Another said, "If this is true, I don't just feel cheated, I feel heartbroken." The story spread like wildfire. YouTube channels started covering it. Christian podcasts picked it up. Then the mainstream press caught wind. Headlines appeared that no one at Daystar could have imagined. Daystar founder accused of misusing donor funds. It didn't matter how the articles were worded, the damage was done. The public was now looking, and once people started looking, they began to see cracks that had been there all along. Jonathan hadn't gone to the media. He hadn't wanted to hurt his family. But when reporters began digging, his quiet truth became the center of the storm. People wanted to hear from him, the son who had dared to ask the question no one else would. But Jonathan stayed mostly silent. He let the facts speak for themselves. Joni, on the other hand, was forced to respond. When she finally did, her words didn't help. She claimed the money had been repaid and that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. But to many, that explanation felt hollow. If it was just a misunderstanding, why had it only been repaid after people started asking questions? Why hadn't anyone known about it before? The timeline didn't add up, and neither did the logic. People weren't just angry. They were hurt. For years, they had trusted Joni with their prayers, their money, their faith. They had believed every word she said on camera. And now, they were realizing that the image of purity and integrity they had believed in might not have been real. The heartbreak was personal. As the backlash grew, cracks appeared inside Daystar itself. Some staff members quietly resigned. Others stayed, but admitted the tension was unbearable. Behind the scenes, meetings were filled with nervous whispers and closed doors. No one knew what to say on camera anymore. What had once been a place of worship and inspiration now felt like a studio built on secrets. Longtime viewers stopped tuning in. Donations dropped. Pastors who had once partnered with Daystar began distancing themselves, not wanting to be tied to the scandal. The phones that had once rung non-stop with prayer requests were suddenly quiet, and the few people still answering them didn't know what to say when callers asked the same question over and over: "Is it true?" Meanwhile, social media was relentless. Every photo Joni posted, every clip from her show, every appearance was met with comments demanding answers. Where did the money go? Why won't you talk about it? You preach honesty. Where's yours? No matter how many times the ministry tried to move on, the questions kept coming. Then came the videos, tearful uploads from former supporters, many of them older women who had watched Daystar for decades. They weren't screaming or angry. They were devastated. "I thought I was giving to God's work," one said softly, wiping her eyes. "Now I don't know who I was giving to. It was raw and human and impossible to ignore." Even some inside Christian media began to speak out, calling for transparency and accountability. For years, religious networks had operated behind a veil of trust, rarely questioned by their own followers. But this time, people wanted proof. They wanted to see receipts. They wanted to know that the money they gave in faith wasn't being used for personal luxury. The story reached further than anyone expected. Watchdog groups picked it up, showing how Daystar's church classification had allowed it to avoid public financial reporting. What had once been a clever legal move now looked like a red flag. Commentators began asking bigger questions, not just about Joni, but about the entire system that allowed something like this to happen. Inside Daystar, Joni kept showing up. She smiled on camera, she led prayers, she spoke about forgiveness and perseverance. But even through the screen, something felt off. Her warmth seemed forced. The sparkle that once drew people in was gone. For the first time, viewers could see the strain behind the smile. The scandal wasn't just about a check, or a trip, or even a broken rule. It was about trust, the kind that can't be rebuilt with statements or press releases. The $100,000 might have been returned, but something far more valuable was lost. The belief that Daystar was a ministry above reproach, a safe place for faith, had vanished. And once trust is broken, no amount of sermons or songs can bring it back. By the time the scandal reached its peak, something inside the world of Daystar had already changed forever. The lights were still shining, the cameras still rolled, Joni still smiled from her seat behind the glossy white desk, but everyone watching could feel it. The energy was gone. What once felt warm and alive now felt hollow. You could almost see the weight behind her eyes, like she was holding back a truth too heavy to carry on her own. Behind the scenes, everything was falling apart. The team that had once worked like family now barely spoke. Meetings were quiet. Hallways that used to buzz with laughter and music were filled with silence. Some employees avoided each other's eyes, afraid to talk about what everyone already knew. The question that had started in one small boardroom, "Did you use $100,000 of ministry money for your honeymoon?" had become a wildfire that no one could control. Donations began to drop fast. People who had tithed faithfully for years stopped giving. Churches that once promoted Daystar quietly removed the network from their bulletins. The phone lines that once overflowed with prayer requests now rang less and less. It wasn't anger that caused the drop, it was heartbreak. People felt betrayed. They didn't want revenge. They wanted answers, but none came. For months, Joni avoided the topic on air. She talked about faith, about endurance, about pushing through hard times, but she never mentioned the scandal, and that silence became its own kind of confession. Every time she preached about integrity, viewers winced. Every time she spoke about truth, comments flooded social media. Practice what you preach. Even the loyal ones, the people who had defended her online when the story first broke, started to fade away. They had believed her when she said it was a misunderstanding, that she had paid the money back. But as time passed and no real transparency came, that trust eroded too. People began to realize that Daystar wasn't offering explanations because there weren't any good ones to give. Inside the ministry, the pressure was unbearable. Some longtime staff members resigned quietly, unwilling to be part of something that now felt tainted. Others stayed, hoping things would somehow return to normal, but normal never came back. The more Joni tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, the more distant she seemed from the people who had once believed in her the most. Jimmy Evans, who had already shaken the ministry with his earlier confession, spoke again during a sermon months later. Without naming names, he talked about how silence in the face of sin is still sin. Those words echoed far beyond his church. People took it as a quiet reference to Daystar, a reminder that pretending nothing happened was its own kind of lie. By then, the damage was everywhere. Donations weren't the only thing that had fallen. Credibility had too. Viewership plummeted. Ratings that once reached millions dropped week by week. Advertisers hesitated. Partner ministries stepped back. The financial impact was deep, but the emotional one was deeper. Former supporters created online groups not to gossip, but to grieve. They shared memories of how much Daystar had meant to them, how Joni's words once helped them through loss or depression, how the broadcasts had been part of their daily faith routine. Now they felt abandoned, like children left in the dark. One woman wrote, "It's not just about $100,000. It's about the years I believed in something that wasn't what it seemed." Another replied, "I don't even watch Christian TV anymore. I don't trust any of them now." That was the real fallout. The loss of faith didn't just affect Daystar, it spread wider. Other ministries felt the tremors. People started questioning where their donations really went. Watchdog groups began investigating other networks with the same church classification loophole. The scandal had exposed more than one family. It had exposed a system that allowed spiritual leaders to act like CEOs without oversight. The calls for accountability grew louder. Christian blogs and journalists demanded transparency, not just from Daystar, but from all faith-based organizations that operated under secrecy. If you're asking for money, one commentator said, "You owe people honesty. God doesn't bless deception." Even secular media picked up the story again, framing it as a modern example of how unchecked religious empires could thrive without scrutiny. Joni stayed mostly quiet through it all. Occasionally, she'd post on social media about rising above trials or trusting God's timing, but never about the scandal itself. Every word felt carefully chosen, polished, edited. But authenticity can't be staged, and people saw through it. Every post brought more comments, more anger, more heartbreak. "You taught us to be accountable," one follower wrote. "Now show us how." Behind closed doors, things were even worse. Insiders said morale was at an all-time low. Some employees felt ashamed to tell people where they worked. Others stayed only because they needed the paycheck. Daystar, once full of life, was now suffocating under the weight of its own silence. Meanwhile, Jonathan had gone quiet too. He hadn't gone on any talk shows or done interviews. He didn't need to. His question had already done what no expose could. It revealed the truth. He had simply asked what no one else dared to. And because he did, the illusion cracked. In time, the network began to downsize. Fewer programs, smaller budgets, reduced staff. The empire still stood, but the foundation was fragile. You could feel the shift, like a grand building that still looked beautiful from the outside, but had termites eating away inside its walls. One good shake, and it could all collapse. Yet, out of the mess, something began to change in the wider Christian community. Churches started holding internal reviews. Some ministries began publishing their financial records voluntarily. Others invited outside auditors for the first time. People were waking up. They didn't want to destroy faith. They wanted to protect it. They wanted to make sure that what happened at Daystar would never happen again. The irony was that Joni could have saved herself and the ministry with one act of humility, one moment of honesty. If she had sat down on camera, looked straight into the lens and said, "I made a mistake. I used money I shouldn't have, and I'm truly sorry," people might have forgiven her. The same viewers who gave so freely would have offered grace just as freely. But that moment never came. Pride stood where repentance should have been. In the end, the scandal wasn't just about missing money. It was about something much bigger, the slow decay that happens when image becomes more important than truth. Daystar didn't fall because of one bad decision. It fell because for too long, no one was brave enough to question those decisions. Now, years later, people still talk about it, not with anger, but with sadness. They remember how Daystar once felt like a light in the darkness, how Joni's words once brought comfort, but the trust is gone, and with it, the innocence that made people believe in something bigger than themselves. Daystar still airs, the music still plays, the sermons still sound powerful, but the heart that once made it real, that sense of sincerity, of faith that felt pure, is gone. In its place is a lesson written in quiet ruin. When truth is hidden, faith fades. And the only thing louder than Joni's silence now is the echo of a question that started it all. A question that still hangs in the air like a ghost. Did you use the money?